So, in this final, or hopefully final video for Chapter 37, we're going to focus on decolonization in Africa, what that process was like to become decolonized, and what are some of the issues that have occurred as a result of decolonization, and also some of the beginnings from things beyond that when they actually became imperialized. And then if we have time, we'll switch over to and revisit Latin America and their results of things going from, or things they've been dealing with following World War II. So, to kind of rehash a lot of the same things what we've already talked about throughout this chapter. While many want independence, including our nationalist movements in Africa, are nothing new, and Europe is fairly weakened at this point as a result, again, of World War I, the Great Depression, and now World War II, you still have a lot of racist views within Europe about the idea of could Africans actually run their own affairs, the idea, you can just kind of go on with more of those thoughts, which I'm not really going to explain here, but you can kind of see that in here, being incapable of governing, that they need oversight, control from, the strong Western Christian hand, things of that nature. But you also have other issues as well, including colonies that have very high levels, or at least decently strong levels, of white settlers who do not want to give up power or their land or businesses. And then also you have Western businesses that still have a lot of control in these territories and do not want to lose any profits. And also you have Cold War politics that delay independence, even though there's a lot of protests, boycotts, political agitation, and in some cases there's a lot of violence, in particular with bloody revolutionary conflicts such as Algeria and in Kenya, which again, the book dives a lot further into than we do here. All right. So, many of the newly independent countries, in particular within Africa, as it now happens, following mostly the late 1950s through the 1970s, are led initially by those educated under Western schools or themselves traveling into the West or into Europe to get educated. And they're the leaders who have been part of the movements. They have experience within government. And also they try to aid, many of them, I should say, try to aid other countries along the way. The leaders early on would dress in traditional African clothing, and it focuses on emphasis on traditional cultures about being proud of being African and black, which is a continuation of the negritude movement that we talked about in the 1920s and 30s for, black leaders and or African and black leaders to again talk about black is beautiful, and the idea that Africans and blacks are strong and smart enough to govern their own affairs and do that without the interference or influence of Europe. So much even talking about again going back to the barbarism of Europe destroying African societies that had worked very effectively on their own for hundreds of years, and then also the implication of the loss of that culture resulting from again slavery or colonialism. So, unfortunately, while you have a lot of this good stuff here talking about at the beginning, and again, the book does break this down a lot more, many of the economies, unfortunately, struggle because of globalization and neocolonialism. So again, tying them and forcing them back into exporting cash crops, mining for European companies or for European profits, the force of many people to still be in subsistence agriculture, and pretty much delaying the actual buildup of their own industries on their own terms. So essentially they rely upon Europe or European businesses to get money, to get financing for infrastructure improvements, to build up their own businesses, again, as a result of, imperialism and neocolonialism. In many cases, you sometimes find intentionally poor leadership. Other times it's just, not good leadership, leading to revolutions, and unfortunately in many cases, military dictatorships. So by about the mid-1970s and early 80s, about half of Africa is run by a military dictatorship that is suppressing democratic freedoms, political freedoms, and then also not giving up power to democratically elected officials. We also have to consider the fact that many of the countries are created pretty much around colonial boundaries that ignored ethnic or religious or racial boundaries from before, or tribal ones before. And they caused conflict during and after independence, like within South Sudan and Darfur. Rwanda in the 1990s, and even pre the Rwanda genocide, where they had other internal conflicts between the Hutus and the Tutsis, and then also within Nigeria as well, due to having over 300 different recognized ethnic groups and dozens and dozens of different languages and affiliations, kind of trying to force them all together when there is no real cohesive thing other than the border was drawn by Britain. All right, so. Those are kind of the things that we see, and we also get, again, that image down here of neocolonialism in Africa that, Africa is rich with natural resources, but again, taken kind of again on that idea of being the periphery or the developing world, and being forced to give their stuff to help out the aid of the developed world. So again, that's where you want to look more specifically at a lot of those specific, events, including, Algeria, because similar with, Vietnam, Algeria, essentially once the Vietnam War ended, the French didn't want to give up their Algerian territory, which did have heavy French settlements in there, but again led to another 8-year protracted guerrilla war, similar to what the French just found, except now more in the deserts than the cities than it was in the jungles of Vietnam. All right, and then Kenya also has its own issues, but Ghana is a standing example about how they earned their freedom in terms of trying to do it non-violently. But that again was very short term within Ghana for a time. So that's kind of where there's so many different case studies within Africa that we couldn't go over them in this video. But one in particular that we're going to look at is South Africa, because of the fact that apartheid, which was that racial segregation, continued to exist for decades after they declared independence. So the former British and Dutch settler colony, where whites made up about 10% of the population, never ever a majority, so it was pretty much minority rule, designed the apartheid system to essentially keep Africans, or I should say black Africans, in a state of being without power, or I should say political or economic power, and reducing their abilities to essentially fight back. So essentially black suppression through segregation of their own, including arrests and murders, banning black organizations or independents or political parties, and by also calling a lot of their leaders communists, similar to what the United States did in segregation during the Jim Crow era, or the Civil Rights era. So you can kind of see here the racial concentration in the homelands. Homelands, essentially, if you look down here, okay, black areas have no other racial groups as high as 30%. The homelands are traditional areas set aside by the African or South African government for specific black ethnic groups. All right, so all have a black population in excess of 90%. Got nominal independence, but still not a whole lot of stuff within these homeland territories that are white. Or kind of in this white, light gray kind of thing. But you kind of see most of the land is occupied by whites, or, these are kind of the wealthiest areas where you see a lot of, in this case, a lot of the best types of farming. So again, this is more of the grain and wheat exports and livestock and ranching, kind of, again, located in there. You don't really see, the mines are kind of, for diamonds, kind of up in this area, I believe. Didn't really do a good job of locating that map on here, or putting it in a good spot or making it well sized. But essentially, the areas that are controlled by whites are typically the most profitable in terms of export crops. So, yeah. And so eventually, facing internal boycotts and external boycotts from abroad, including for the Olympics and protests, eventually lead to the end of apartheid in the early 1990s, a very, very long time for segregation to continue to be legal in South Africa, well beyond when it was slowly becoming illegal in the United States at its various levels. It took South Africa much, much longer, but the big difference is South Africa, the whites were the minority of the population. In the United States, the whites were the majority, and maybe minorities in small communities in the South, but again, still had all the political clout, power, and numbers, right? So, since apartheid ended in the 90s, okay, blacks have the political power through the, I believe, African National Congress. I believe that's what ANC stands for. I might be wrong on the A part. And more opportunity since apartheid ended, but most of the industries and the wealth and the land is still pretty much within the hands of the whites. All right, so that's something to keep in mind when we think about South Africa. Yes, they've made a lot of gains and strides, but still a lot of diverging paths in terms of economic abilities in there. So kind of, again, some other maps to look at. Africa today, and then whole your tribal and ethnic maps here, over here, being within the black lines compared to the overlay of the red lines. The different ethnicities within Nigeria, okay, different ethnic groups here in Sudan and South Sudan. So again, kind of helping to talk a little bit about, some of those ethnic differences and conflicts still going on within Africa. So then to kind of wrap up the chapter talking about Latin America, politics and the economies. So an attempt to now end or limit neocolonialism, which we've previously mentioned a little bit within chapter 35. So, in terms of some of the political issues or economic ones, so there are early attempts at democratic or socialist reforms that lead, unfortunately, to many military coups or dictatorships or U.S.-backed interventions, including in Nicaragua, Guatemala, where they believed, or even attempted ones within Cuba. Anyone that was, again, essentially believed to be supporting a communist regime faced United States backlash or sanctions. And you have to remember that, unfortunately, a lot of the areas in Latin America had histories of those strongmen, the military leaders, the Caudillo dictatorships, going back to independence. And since the last, 30, 40 years, you have more democratic groups in there. But again, you're still facing a lot of corruption. You're still seeing a lot of military-backed efforts within that. This also plays in, again, with neocolonialism and the dependency theory that core countries such as the United States, Western Europe, expand and do well at the expense of periphery countries through that extraction of natural resources. So what we've seen in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And so there is attempts within Latin American countries under their governments and economies to diversify away from being just export-oriented to build up their own infrastructure and limit that dependency theory and colonialism. And World War II helps us in a little bit because of the expanded output in terms of food and manufactured goods that they're producing for countries at war while they are, in a sense, neutral, and then can reinvest that money into their own country. But again, there are still wealth gaps due to dictatorships and militaries being in control of a lot. So kind of revisiting back from Mexico, the land and economic reform. So following that Constitution of 1917 to finally redistribute the land to the vast majority of, the poor farmer. All right. Unfortunately, again, we see U.S. interventions in Guatemala on behalf of United Fruit for nationalizing their industries, in Chile and Nicaragua for, believing that there's going to be communist governments in there. So very much the U.S. is against that, believing again in the dependency, or not dependency, but the domino theory, and try and contain communism where it was. Cuba, becomes independent, but it was dependent on U.S. trade following its freedom from Spain until Castro's revolution, and then begins to nationalize the businesses and industries, which a lot of the United States had money in, especially again if you were in Miami or somewhere in Florida, leading to Castro turning to the Soviet Union for aid. Through the Bay of Pigs, the U.S. tries to support coups against him, and then leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis, again mentioned in the previous chapter. But that leads to Cuba becoming dependent on the Soviet Union, but better social programs, literacy, healthcare, things like that, spreading across the rural areas. For women's rights, in terms of Latin America, which we haven't really talked about in many of the countries, we talked a little bit about it with China, with their Communist Party, at least the idea of it anyway, that women in many areas are advocating for increased economic and political rights for all, but only slowly gain them, including, the right to vote not coming really for many until the 1960s and 70s. And so, with Latin America today, if you looked at it for comparison purposes, in terms of literacy, education, job opportunities, roles in government, all of that, ranks between Europe and the United States, or below them, and kind of above at most of Africa and Asia, but not all right, in terms of all those kind of things. So the shift away again from, this is a shift as they go away from the domestic roles as birth rates drop, leading again to an increased sign that women's rights and empowerment has increased because of the declining birth rates, right? One of the other things that we do continually see in Latin America is that millions in the region, including within the Caribbean, migrating to primate cities or to other countries for work, for political freedom and safety, so think again, getting away from cartels, or just natural disaster and civil war. So things again to consider within all this. So kind of taking in, how does everyone deal with neocolonialism? How do they deal with independence? Not just with Europe, but also the United States, but also thinking about, confronting or dealing with socialist movements, either for or against, and what that kind of relates to. So a whole lot of stuff is coming back all the way from what we began this chapter on, all right, when we started talking about these main ideas, concepts, and takeaways in terms of the end of the empire and putting this in the Cold War context for actions that occur within these countries, between countries, different parts of the world, and yeah, how that also plays in with gender too. So that's where we're going to wrap up chapter 37. One more to go, and then on to review.